All right, the topic I chose for this presentation was the alarming increase in children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and why. This subject hits real close to home for me for the mere fact that I have my oldest son, who is 8, has been diagnosed with Asperger's and then later autism or ASD4. And growing up, my youngest brother is 10 years younger than me, was diagnosed with Asperger's as well. So I chose this topic for the mere fact that I thought that I knew the answers to the question, and my clinically diagnosed OCD kicked in and went, let me do some research. It was very interesting. I learned quite a bit. Initially, I felt that the increase was just a mere factor of increased awareness and like acceptance socially, that because generationally in the past, neurological disorders weren't accepted nor recognized, nor was there any testing for it. And since 1990 through now, things have changed and they've progressed with their testing, and there's been a huge acceptance and growth in resources for people with ASD and Asperger's or any of those neurological disorders. So especially in Brevard County has been great. You should see the police car that goes around. That's got the autism and the fucking puzzle pieces on it. Sorry, excuse my language. Anyway, what I did learn that I didn't realize, I thought it was all just about awareness, and some of the resources I found said that, it in certain states that it is the awareness and the resources that people have that's why their diagnosis rates are increasing. But when you say ASD or autism spectrum disorder, they say spectrum for a reason. It's a big umbrella. There's high functioning, there's low functioning, there's a lot of different differentiations underneath that umbrella. And something I didn't realize, and maybe I should have, because both my brother and my son were diagnosed with Asperger's first. Well, first my son was developmentally delayed, and then it was Asperger's, and then all of a sudden it was autism. The resources and the way insurance works, they needed a diagnosis, so he's been seeing every 2 years a clinical psychologist that diagnoses him with whatever they deem acceptable. What I didn't realize is that Asperger's no longer constituted as its own diagnosis. Asperger's is under the umbrella of autism. Mostly because the clinical definition of autism is the deficit of social and communicative ability. So when you think of autism and when they diagnose it, it's kids that have a deficit in the ability to recognize social situations, or just the ability to recognize what's acceptable and what's not. And my son does that. He talks. They'll repeatedly talk about what they think is interesting, and they'll keep going on that way. But I never realized that the umbrella of an autism diagnosis is so vast. There's I think it's the Q22 disorders under there. There's Asperger's. There's developmentally delayed. The way they define autism clinically is so vague that so many disorders fall under that umbrella. And the awareness of autism and the awareness of all of these social disorders have become so accepted socially that it seems that the rates in autism are rising. They're, at the end of the day, they're really not. If you look at the fucking research, the numbers really stay the same. If you're looking at a neurological disorder, they just take all of those neurological disorders and put them under one category, which is autism. The numbers really stay quite the same. My son was diagnosed with Asperger's, so was my brother. And then later down the road, they were like, it's ASD4, which is high functioning autism. But it's because Asperger's is no longer deemed an acceptable diagnosis. So all of these neurological disorders are now being put into one category. But if you look at the number of neurological disorders that are being diagnosed from 1990 to now, it's the same, it's relatively the same. They just aren't under the autism umbrella in the beginning. So I didn't realize that. And I think it's funny because when I picked this topic, I thought I knew what I was talking about. Having a son with autism and a brother, that I really just thought it was awareness and the testing developing and the research developing that's why diagnoses were increasing. But it's really not. It's really the fact that they're taking a group of diagnoses and putting them all under the same umbrella. It's just communication and social inability to conform, and they're putting all of those disorders under one umbrella. So the definition is that, it's just socially and emotionally and communicatively deficit. That can include almost anything. I am OCD, clinically diagnosed OCD. Certain things socially, I have issues with. I guarantee you that could be put under the umbrella of autism. Asperger's is a high-functioning autistic person. That's what they claim it as. Because autism at a low standard is someone that's nonverbal. They don't emotionally or socially conform in social situations. But as with Asperger's, the social part's taken out and the emotional part is taken out, but they can communicate very well. They speak, they're very logical and very, what's the word I'm looking for? Literal. When I tell my son something, it's literal. So if you use sarcasm or anything of that nature, it doesn't come across that way. He doesn't get it. But with the lower functioning autism, some of them don't speak at all. My son goes to a place called the Sonder Academy, which is in Brevard County, which they have an amazing amount of support and resources for the autistic community. But there are kids that I've seen that my son goes to school with that don't speak and maybe have violent tendencies because they're overwhelmed with stimuli, like it's too loud, or they're overwhelmed and they don't know how to handle it. So there's low functioning to high functioning. High functioning usually is verbal, low functioning usually maybe not so much. There's violent tendencies, but it's not it's not out of aggression, it's more out of being overwhelmed and not being able to correspond to the situation. It's such a wide array of, sorry, I got 3 kids screaming in the background. It's such a wide array of criteria and symptoms between each individual diagnosis, and the fact that now all of a sudden they're putting them all under the same category. Yeah, it looks like there's a lot of autistic people, but at the end of the day, it's more widely socially acceptable. There's more resources and more people willing to come forward and more information that go, hey, maybe I should look into this. That autism is more acceptable to look at as an option. As a parent of a child with autism, when he was 2 and not verbal, he was my first child, and he didn't speak, and I was a single parent, so I gave us a way to communicate, and my other 2 children now know some sign language, but never thought of autism as a viable option. And sometimes it's a hard concept to come to terms with. It's not fun, it's kind of scary, but now that there's so many resources and information that people that are dealing with it are willing to open up and figure out what's best for their children, I think also has an influence in the diagnosis. Because back when my brother was diagnosed, my stepfather was like that wasn't an option 15 years ago. It was just a learning disability at that point. When Caden, my oldest, was 2, they said he was developmentally delayed, which meant he wasn't where he should have been. Nowadays, they look a little further into it. He went from developmentally delayed to Asperger's to autism, because Asperger's is no longer its own diagnosis. It's under the umbrella of autism. So at the end of the day, the neurological disorders that are being diagnosed, really, the numbers aren't really increasing that much. It's just that they're all being categorized under one category versus all separate within their own selves. So there is, it seems alarming, and the whole immunization thing is a whole all in itself. As a parent of a child with autism, I'd rather my child be vaccinated and alive than not and be neurotypical, that's what we like to call them, and alive. Like neurotypical and dead versus autistic and alive, it's a big difference. But research has shown that immunizations really have nothing to play in this. But anyways, I'll go down that road. The increase, what seems alarming as an increase in diagnoses, really isn't an alarming increase in people being born with a disorder. It's an awareness in certain states, it's an awareness and resources in certain places, and it's an umbrella of a vast variety of disorders that are neurological under one umbrella. And they're learning every day new testing and new assessments to clinically diagnose somebody and give them the resources they need. So we're learning every day. As with any clinical diagnosis. There's always research that's progressing, and the more we progress, the more we know, and the more society progresses with acceptance of different people, regardless of what that means, genders, whatever. It's going to increase because people are going to be more willing to come out and say, hey, we need some help. So the numbers really haven't changed. They're really quite the same. Just it's an acceptance. It's what we deem to be autistic under that umbrella of communication and social deficits, which is very vague. That's where we see that increase in diagnoses.